For those of you that don't know who Rabobank is, we're a Dutch cooperative bank. We've been in existence for over 100 years, formed by farmers in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, we're a bank just like Bank of America or JP Morgan, financing all parts of business. But outside of the Netherlands, all we do is finance food and agribusiness companies and farmers. So we're a global bank, which is how I got the opportunity to come from Australia to the US. Rather than try and tell you what exactly the new technologies are going to be, what I thought I'd try and do is talk about what the key drivers are behind the need for technological developments, what will impact the uptake of those new developments, and what does that mean, and how do we look at that from a banking perspective. I know that a number of the sessions that you've already attended have touched on how are we going to feed the world, how are we going to feed all of these new people that are coming, and I think that really is a big challenge for the food industry. Population is still growing at around about 1.5% per year. We have just come through a recession, but we still are seeing income growth in key developing regions. With that comes globalization, comes urbanization, westernization of their diets, and so we are seeing significant increase in demand for meat, for seafood, for dairy, and other value-added foods. Our estimates are that food production will need to grow by 40% by 2030 and over 70% by the year 2050. But it's not only the increased demand for food that's challenging the agricultural supply chain, it's also what we've seen in the bioenergy area. That has really increased demand for grains, for sugarcane, and caused a lot of volatility and an increase in the prices in those commodities. So we've got increasing demand, and at the same time we've had a significant slowdown in the rate of productivity growth of the grains sector. Part of that is because a lot of the initial growth that we saw in yields was as a result of increased seeding rates. You put more seeds on, you get more grain produced. And really we've reached a plateau there. We don't have the opportunity to keep on increasing seeding rates any further. We're also being challenged by the fact that new land that is coming into production tends to be less fertile. We're seeing crops like corn grown on corn, so the yields of those corn crops in the second year is less than what it was in the previous year. I think a lot of the genetically modified crops that we saw were all about weed control and pest control, not necessarily about increasing production. And over time, we've seen resistance develop, and that too is having a negative impact on future productivity growth. So we no longer have an environment where you have supply increasing faster than demand. It's leading to that low stocks-to-use ratios that we see, higher prices and more volatility. The third part of this puzzle is the fact that there's not more land to bring into production. And in some cases, we're actually seeing a reduction in the amount of land available as a result of urbanisation, some of the soils that are becoming affected by erosion, salinity, and the like. So when you bring these three things together, an increase in demand, no further land availability, a reduction in productivity, what that really means is that the entire supply chain is going to be looking at ways to increase productivity, and there is definitely a need for future technological developments. One of the other drivers that we see in the agricultural sector is globalisation. We're seeing countries like China looking at where they can invest, whether it be in Africa or Brazil. We see them very interested in forming joint ventures with companies here in the United States or Australia. And one of the key drivers of those joint ventures is to give them access to the technology that those companies have. We're also seeing US companies that are operating in a fairly mature market as they look for growth opportunities, they're looking at places like China. And so OSI, who is one of McDonald's big suppliers, has actually started building poultry farms in China with the latest US technology, and then the processing plants and things like that. So you do have this sharing of knowledge and technology all around the world. We continue to see increased trade. Now, if you're supplying the developing countries, it's probably going to be based on price, but they will, as Russia or China tries to become self-sufficient, if they start to have an increase in supply in, say, poultry or pork, they will suddenly decide that they don't want ractamine pork, or that there is a health issue somewhere, and those markets will suddenly get closed down, which can be a real challenge for the suppliers of those things. And so we do need to keep in mind that technologies that are very acceptable in somewhere like the United States may not be as acceptable in some of those countries that we're wanting to supply, and that is a consideration as we look at how we develop them going forward. The other issue with trade has to do with the fact that if you want to be accessing the high value markets, so markets such as Europe and Japan, then animal ID, traceability are things that are very important in those countries, and we need to be able to meet that. The other thing is making sure that the product that we are exporting to those countries meets the consumer needs. So one of the challenges for the US dairy industry is historically it was very focused on the domestic market. It really wasn't focused on export, just excess production when prices went up, went on to the export market. If you want to be a true export player, then you need to make sure that the blocks of cheese that you're exporting are what those countries want, what the consumers in that international market want, and not just what they would traditionally produce for the domestic market here. Food safety is something that unfortunately we continue to see in the press on a regular basis, whether it's something about an E. coli outbreak, whether it's pigs floating in a river in China or the like. Unfortunately, it is something that's out there and something that people are increasingly concerned about. As a result of that, we will continue to see players all along, particularly food companies, look at what their production systems are, what are the ways that they can improve and bring in new technologies to help them control this. I think in the area of packaging is another area that we're likely to see a lot of developments as companies look for ways to manage these particular risks. I think one of the other things, and this is something that we're seeing very much in China, is as they continue to have these food safety crises there, the governments are really looking at their policies and starting to move towards policies of industrialised agriculture. Rather than having the very small backyard operations, they see the fact that food is safer if it comes from larger, more commercially orientated operations, and that's another trend that we expect to see as we go forward. When there was an abundance of supply, weather events didn't have quite the same impact as what they do today. But the stock-to-use ratios really are so low that if there is a weather event, whether it's flooding, whether it's a drought, or the like, tends to have a much bigger impact today than it did in the past. As you heard, I come from a wheat and sheep farm in Western Australia, and a lot of that land out in the eastern wheat belt of Western Australia should probably never have been cleared. It's very sandy soils, low rainfalls. But one of the conditions when that land was granted to the farmers 60, 70 years ago was that they needed to clear the entire property within a certain period of time. As a result of that, a lot of that land is subject to erosion, some of it's subject to salinity, and there are some real challenges for the farmers going forward. As a result, I think that the land care movement in Western Australia probably leads in what they're doing in relation to salinity, into breeding new grasses that can grow there, and how to control water runoff and the like. And I think that's an important lesson for all industries, is to have a look at who might be having a challenge somewhere, either in another industry or in another region. Find out what they're doing and what it is that you could potentially learn from them. I think we're also, with the drought here in the United States, in the cattle industry, we've had the significant decline in herd numbers, and so we're starting to see increased use of same-sex semen, something that the dairy industry has used for a long time, but the cattle industry is starting to use that technology to try and help them rebuild the cattle herd. There's a lot of things that people can learn from other industries as they look at how it is that they manage these challenges. I think sustainability is the other key driver that's become more and more important for businesses across the entire supply chain. It's certainly something that, as a cooperative bank out of Europe, we get asked about when we're financing all of our customers. We get to go out and visit different customers, and this is a photo that one of my colleagues took at a dairy farm out in California, where not only are they just providing shade to the dairy cows, but they've got solar panels on the shade things, which is generating energy for the use of the dairy. We see similar things in some of our beef processing and poultry processing plants. With natural gas being cheap, people are looking at whether they can put in a cogeneration plant to produce steam and electricity to run the plant. Water byproducts and how wastewater gets utilised are all things that people are continuing to look at, and looking for new technologies of how they can improve the way they manage those byproducts and ways that they could reuse it. Irrigation is also very important. I think although we've talked about the lack of additional land, water is going to be the other factor that really impacts how much increased production we can get and where it can be. Places obviously that have limited water, like California and Israel, lead in some of the irrigation technologies that we see around the world. But somewhere like China, which has a real challenge with water, therefore goes and looks in other parts of the world. It's importing technologies out of Israel as they look at increasing their fruit and vegetable production. I think another thing that's important to remember about countries like China is that they will skip entire technological developments. If there's something that's really good out there that they can access from somewhere else, they might not go through all of the stages that we went through or that country went through in developing that technology. They'll jump one or two development stages and go straight there. But this is an area that I think is going to become increasingly important. It's important to consumers, and therefore it's an area that food and ag companies all along the supply chain will continue to focus on. So that's what we think is going to continue to drive the need for technological developments, and what will impact its uptake. The first thing is obviously having access to technology. I think in the 80s and 90s, when we had a period of surplus supply, we tended to see investment in new innovations tended to go back. This is looking at public research and development spending by region, and in most of the developing regions, it's actually plateaued. We haven't had that continued increase in spending, which means that for farmers in developed regions to have access to new technologies, it's either going to need to be done by private companies, private-public partnerships, or the like. We do continue to see increased investment in developing regions, but as I say, they're also looking very much at what's happening in other regions of the world and looking for opportunities to take that back to their own regions. Sufficient scale and access to capital are also really important if we're going to have farmers being able to access this. we see consolidation and concentration continuing to increase, and expect that to be a trend that continues. Not only are those larger farmers usually more progressive and open to the new technologies, but they also have the scale that's necessary to actually make the investments necessary. If you look once again at the cropping industry and producing enough feed, if you're doing soil mapping and sampling all of your soils, if you're then going to invest in new planting technology with all the latest GPS technology so that you can apply fertilizers as the soils need it, you need to have sufficient farming land to be able to justify that investment. And the really small guys, unfortunately, are not going to be able to make some of those investments that their larger counterparts can. And we will possibly continue to see a larger divide as we go forward to the farmers who've traditionally done it because it's a lifestyle, and those that really are seeing their production as a business. We also believe that as agriculture has become more complex, as consumer demands increase, as we have the impact of biofuels, as people's interest in sustainability increases, the whole value chain is becoming more complex, and we therefore see people starting to operate in dedicated supply chains. Some companies have done this for a long time. People like McDonald's have always had a dedicated supply chain. They have dedicated suppliers that they're very specific about what they want them to supply, how they want it to be supplied, and the information that they pass back to them. But we do see this is a trend that's likely to continue, and if you're not part of those dedicated supply chains, it's going to be harder to get some of the benefits. It's all about cooperating to increase the value for everybody as opposed to just getting the best price. If you are a part of those value chains, you are going to get access to new technologies. You know, there are going to be companies, you know, the final taker that is going to be doing research that they're going to share with their suppliers on how they can increase their productivity. They will help them by providing capital, by helping them develop new markets for their products, and just an overall benefit for everybody in the chain. Consumers are obviously also a really important part of the supply chain, and what they think and feel is going to have an impact on technologies that are taken up, and even whether the technologies that are already in existence can continue. I think one of the real challenges for the ag industry is educating consumers. The majority of consumers have no idea really what GM means. They don't understand that. They don't really understand, you know, that there are some naturally occurring hormones. They don't understand why you would feed an animal some antibiotics. And it is all about educating them and helping them understand what these products are, how the value chain works, and what the benefits are if we want to continue to use those products in the production system. Something, you know, I think historically European consumers have always been very sceptical of the food supplier, and that's why, you know, they have so many questions about GM product and even meat that's been fed GM grain. Historically, the United States consumer has been much more trusting. But I think with some of the scares and some of as social media grows, as media just shares a number of stories, we see lots of films, they are becoming more questioning of the food supply as well. Whether we can come up with technologies that are benefit for the consumer as well as rather than just being, you know, increasing the productivity or reducing the price, the input costs for producers, that may also make them more accepting of some of the new technologies that are out there. But I think having communication strategies, knowing how you want to communicate with consumers is really important. We saw that with LFTB. It's a technology that had an awful lot of benefits, but, you know, the media decided that they were going to paint that a certain way, and that's a product that's no longer really available, or it still is available, but not to the same degree in the food supply chain. RBST is really not used as much in the dairy industry as what it was before. And I think the other thing, in addition to a good communication strategy, is labelling. Consumers don't want surprises. They want to know what it is that's in their food, what it is that they're buying and feeding their children. I think the final factor that really has an impact on whether people are going to adopt new technologies or not is what is the impact of it on their bottom line. We ask, we have historically been in a period of low corn prices, and that had an impact on the entire agricultural production chain, but that's no longer the case. The days of $2 corn are not going to come back, I don't think. People all along the chain are adapting to this new environment. They're looking at ways of increasing their productivity, reducing their costs, and improving their bottom line. I think, at different places in the chain, people are being impacted to different degrees, but that really is something that will have an impact on whether people embrace the new technologies that come along or not. So what does this mean, and how do we look at it from a banking perspective? As a bank, we really want to pick the winners. We're really about financing the people that we believe are going to be there in the longer term. So they do tend to be the larger companies, whether they're producers or processors or all along the chain, the ones that are adopting new technologies that are open to what is happening and understand the changes in their environment are the people that we want to be financing. Many of these technologies, or the adoption of these new technologies, requires significant capital investment. And if farmers and companies don't have sufficient access to capital, that makes it very, very difficult for them to take it up. And I think you need to keep in mind simple things like, in the swine industry where we see people moving to out of gestation crates and doing different things, the investment that's required across the industry can be in billions of dollars, which is significant investment that needs to occur. Higher commodity prices means higher working capital, and that really is a challenge for players all the way across the chain, but definitely creates an opportunity for us. With these requirements, though, risk management becomes increasingly important. We are in a period of increased volatility, higher prices, and therefore we need to know not only that people are doing financial hedging, but they are looking at their entire production system and looking at ways of reducing the risk to ensure that they could survive in the longer term.